Well, hello! Today I'm going to be breaking down the level blockout for my Shadow of the Tomb Raider personal project. This video is going to be broken down into 7 sections, starting with planning and design documentation, then research and reference gathering, metrics, the top-down map, which tools I used, the actual level blockout, and finally the scripting I did to complete the level. If at any point you want to skip to one of these sections, you can do so using the chapter markers on YouTube. Let's jump straight into the planning and documentation phase. Before delving into research, top-down mapping, or blockout, I established the high-level story and gameplay beats. Starting development here allowed me to rapidly iron out narrative inconsistencies, dull locations, pacing slumps, and repetitive gameplay beats without investing precious time into building something that fundamentally would not work. For example, my first iteration on the level beats started with a bang and sort of petered out after the middle. I cut and reorganized sections of the level plan over a couple iterations until it reached a more engaging roller coaster style pacing. At the AAA level, this sort of planning would be essential to make sure that the game shipped on budget and on time. After ironing out the high-level identity for the level, I delved into research and reference gathering. Shadow of the Tomb Raider takes place in Peru, showcasing the Amazon rainforest's beauty and the exotic architecture of a fictionalized hybrid Maya-Inca civilization. Since I had the benefit of developing for a game that had already shipped, I learned first from the game itself by documenting level, gameplay, and environment techniques from design talks and my own playthroughs. I then sought inspiration beyond the game by investigating Maya and Inca culture through articles, photos, and books. By the end of this phase, I had 300 images and more than 50 other sources to use in creating environments that felt believable, while still evoking that signature Tomb Raider sense of high adventure. Several of the level's distinguishing visual characteristics arose from this research. For instance, during the blockout phase, you'll see many instances of these gnarly jaguar head statues placed around the ruins. Since the level is set in an animal trafficking camp, I also drew from pictures of zoos for caged animals. These unique features help sell the location and make it memorable. While researching, I was simultaneously figuring out the level metrics in a gym level inside Unreal Engine 4. Tomb Raider is part action game, part platformer, and part adventure game. Each of these aspects required finessing gameplay metrics to be functional and intuitive. To nail Lara Croft's various abilities, I built a metrics gym inside Unreal Engine 4, where I could figure out widths, heights, and distances. Jumping and climbing distances were especially tricky because I had to make sure the player could reliably interpret their environment to form plans. The jumps had to account for whether the player was sprinting, the perceived reach of the character model, and the feel of the animations. I tackled the problem by creating 3 distinct sets of heights, jump height, mantle height, and tall mantle, distances, standard jump, long jump, and extreme jump, and their respective buffer zones, distance ranges that didn't read clearly because they fell between the defined sets. In this way, I ensured that players understood at a glance which jumps they could and could not make. I also figured out door heights and widths, climbing distances, cover heights and distances, and even the spaces between trees needed for the camera to fit fluidly while moving through jungle situations. Finding the metrics before designing further gave me an understanding of how things needed to fit together to build an intuitive, easily readable space. With the research done and metrics hashed out, I turned to paper prototyping to do something very, super, ultra scientific. Try stuff. The advantage of paper is that testing an idea is quick and cheap. The first thing you'll notice is that this is a bit of a mess, and that's because I would never present this to anyone, except you, dear viewer, except you. While working on paper, I don't worry too much about metrics. I focus instead on the spatial concepts that would fit each of the level beats. When I had sufficiently narrowed down those ideas, I booted up Adobe Illustrator to draw a clean, readable top-down map that was also built to scale. By the time I had reached this phase, I'd significantly cut down on the level beats to stay within scope for the project. There was originally going to be a whole other cave section, a jaguar fight, and even a puzzle. But by the time I started drawing the map in Illustrator, I knew I wouldn't be able to build that much quality gameplay in 6 months while also working and going to school. That's all part of the process. Let's take a look at some of the features of this top-down map. Levels in Shadow of the Tomb Raider often rely on linear exploration segments. These corridor-like areas showcase the world and get the player wondering what lies beyond. In my level, the player would start in one such section in a repurposed animal cage tucked inside a cave. The cave contains supply crates, implying that it's a makeshift storage area for Trinity mercenaries. It doesn't reveal too much about what lies ahead, creating the potential for discovery. As the player makes their way outside, they realize they're in an animal trafficking camp that the mercenaries use to make extra cash on the side. Featured in the middle of the camp would be a caged jaguar, which I felt really solidified the level's identity. Another feature in Tomb Raider level design is 3-lane stealth routes. The design offers players agency over how to approach a combat encounter. I chose to include 2 stealth routes in my own map, one in a small cave beneath the helicopter landing, and another along the cliff overlooking the river. For players who wanted to go loud, I offered options on the high ground and the middle lane. Following the combat encounter, the player tackles a short climbing route along the inner edge of camp, leading them through some ruins as they go. Finally, they would use a rope arrow to cross a river and reunite with Jonah. Each of the steps up to this point served to test and prove ideas as quickly and efficiently as possible, which is critical when working on large teams where development is expensive. The Illustrator map was the culmination of that effort, easily communicating the level flow, showing the ideas fitting within the game metrics, and painting a picture of the environmental identity, as well as serving as a jumping-off point moving into the Blockout phase. But before I get into that, I want to give a quick shout out to each of the tools that I used to build this project. The first is integration with ALS. The pack builds off the popular Advanced Locomotion System V4 by adding mechanics like climbing, shooting, weapon switching, and basic stealth combat AI. It would be hard to do better for trying to prototype games similar to Uncharted or Tomb Raider. You can get a hold of it by subscribing to Jakub W on Patreon. The second resource is the Blockout Tools plugin by someone very talented, but whose name is too difficult for me to pronounce. This nifty creation makes grayboxing quick as candy. I swear that's a saying. Promise. It consists of various primitive elements with convenient scale and transform controls, and a custom triplanar grid material to ease the level design workflow. You can grab it for just $15 off the Unreal Marketplace. The next tool is the POLYGON Prototype Pack by Synty Studios. For just $5 on the Unreal Marketplace, you get access to more than 400 low-poly props, icons, characters, static character poses, and environment assets. Perfect for grayboxing. Finally, I used this cool Rustle sound effect created by Carolyn Ford, courtesy of SoundBible.com, and licensed under Creative Commons. If you're interested in any of these resources, don't you fret. I'll include links to each of them in the video description. As I moved into Blockout, I found a lot of opportunities to improve the design. In this section, I'll break down my decisions as I walk through the level. To set the stage, Trinity mercenaries ambush Lara and Jonah. She holds off the soldiers while Jonah escapes, but she is captured in the process. Awaking in a makeshift cage at the back of a cave, Lara sees a soldier chatting with his buddy, a guard leaning against her cage. The soldier leaves, and Lara strangles the guard through the cage bars. Then, the player gets control. Coming out of the cage, I want to point out a couple things helping sell this narrative beat. Remember, Lara has just been captured and separated from Jonah. It is a low point in the story. She's alone, confined in this dark cave without any idea what lies ahead. It's damp too, you can see in the puddle in front of her. All of this works to remind the player this situation is bad. In the distance, the player hears an unsettling metal rattling noise. Here on the wall, a grotesque shadow thrashes at the air. Its purpose is twofold. First, I want the player to feel fear, as Lara would in the situation. Second, I want to draw the player in that direction with something so compelling that they don't stop to observe their surroundings. I'll tell you why in a second. As the player rounds the corner, they discover that the ferocious shadow was none other than a cute animal in a cage. The collectible document reveals that the mercenaries are running an animal trafficking operation to bolster their profits. It fleshes out the world and foreshadows the next section of the level. Realizing they're at a dead end, the player turns around and discovers the actual way forward. This is why I couldn't have the player's attention wandering before they turned around. In previous iterations, I tried luring the player forward using a semi-obscured crate, but they always turned to explore before completing the loop. The design wasn't captivating enough to create the experience I was going for, so I came up with the animal shadows and cage rattling to take it to the next level. The break in the mine scaffolding helps draw the player into a partially hidden exploration section. Trapped beneath collapsed rock and scaffolding, the skeleton of a miner adds history to the location by suggesting a failed mining operation long ago. This would be gold that the player can collect and use as in-game currency. More debris serves to keep the player from walking in a straight line. Mixing up movement helps keep them engaged. The cave-in subtly dissuades players, getting them to look around the space a little, thus finding this alternate route. The collapsed cave ceiling shows the player a glimpse of the outside world. It serves the narrative beat by offering a glimmer of hope at escaping. Then the pit drops them right back at the cage. The light and open sky starkly contrast the cage and dark, damp cave, basically slapping the player in the face with the fact of their imprisonment. A twist of the knife, so to speak. The exploration section, while hidden, is not super hard to find. I want the player to discover and enjoy the area. It helps sell the narrative. Plus, it keeps the player in the caves longer, extending playtime and eking out more value from the environmental assets. The exit out of the cave is this slow, winding arc, which builds the tension as the player wonders what lies in wait. This soldier was the guard's friend from earlier. He would start at the base of the ladder and climb upwards into his current position while the player was approaching the cave exit. As you take out the soldier, the camera draws upwards to show none other than Jonah. He'd put his finger to his mouth, telling you to be quiet, then point off to the right before disappearing. I wanted to show the giant jaguar head statue before the upcoming combat section. This way, the player knows their objective before their attentional resources are diverted. Compare this sequence to how I started with the top-down map. Right off the bat, the high ground enemy and his counterpart made the player feel vulnerable. With no safe space to form a plan, the cognitive load is heightened. Entering into the animal trafficking camp, the player was expected to process their route options, enemy locations, the caged jaguar, the statue landmark, and do it while forming a plan in an area with minimal cover and many enemies. Hence why I chose to break these down into more digestible chunks. In the final version, the player already knows their objective. This high ground surveys the entire camp, acting as a natural decision point. From safety, players have enough time and mental resources to parse the enemies harassing the caged jaguar, the guard unloading the truck, and the flanking routes. The careful staging of information enables player planning and gives them time to absorb the environmental storytelling. The result is a more satisfying, engaging experience. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is based around stealth combat. These routes along the edges of the camp keep players at a distance from enemies, allowing players to follow their instincts and stick to the shadows. To discourage engaging a head-on firefight, I've used these breakable wooden crates. Because cover is unreliable, it's safer to use wits to take on the mercenaries. I like that the crates discourage, but still allow for gung-ho tactics, so long as players are willing to reposition or hide frequently. That way, gamers of all kinds can play their preferred way. Framed between the wooden pole and the green sheet metal would be a box of salvage. These collectibles unlock weapon upgrades, so they're a nice reward for exploring more of the space. The mercenary walking into the storage shanty leads the player into the space while signaling that they should move carefully so as not to accidentally get spotted when entering, which would feel pretty bad. These jaguar heads, jammed together along the shelf, are revealed as the player enters. The jaws would be sharp and gaping. The heads tell the narrative of the trafficking operation and burn the level into the player's memory. The framing of the door reminds players about the enemy guarding the stairwell, while clearly showing where to go. From this position, the player has more possible angles to distract or take down enemies. Bottles can be used to distract or stun enemies. If the player explores over to the right, they discover a fallen jaguar head statue and architectural debris like chunks of ancient stairwell. On the other side of the raging river would be denser forest. The motion of the water draws player attention to the left, where they can find a hidden artifact. If the player continues straight, they climb the ancient stairwell towards their objective. Here, a large rock has fallen, smashing the rest of the stairwell. The series of jaguar head statues draws the player's attention upwards to these ruins, which are just barely visible past the cliff edge. Beneath the giant statue, the player gets an artifact as a reward for completing the stealth combat. The cycle of challenge and achievement is one reason video games are so engaging, so I am making sure to capitalize on that here. In the first iteration, the player reunited with Jonah just after this segment, bringing the level to a close. However, two key aspects of the Tomb Raider experience were missing: harrowing climbing gameplay and awe-inspiring architecture. By adding these in, I could create something that felt true to the series and that followed a better pacing curve. I started by massively expanding this climbing section, having the player scale a cliff over raging waters. Upon reaching this ledge, the rock would snap, sending the player plummeting towards the water. They would have to react quick enough to grab this rock face. The moment kicks up adrenaline, helping match the player experience to Laura's. The dead tree acts as a landmark for the player when they later return to this part of the climb. Unfortunately, after going just beneath it, the ledge gives, and the player plummets to the river. By this point, Laura is beaten and bruised from imprisonment, combat, and 2 falls. The jumps in this section are just barely within reach, helping sell the effort it takes for Laura to keep moving. The final jump puts Laura right at the edge of hungry waters. They lap at her, trying to drag her under. Rock outcroppings along the cliff face break up the climbing gameplay so the player doesn't get bored using the same movement mechanics for too long. Again, the dead tree serves to remind the player of where they've been, where they are, and to give them a sense of progress. A quick note, all the climbing sections are approximations. Once the full gameplay systems were implemented, these sections would need redoing to account for abilities like long jumps. At the top of the cliff, the player rediscovers the small jaguar statue, helping fill in the blanks of their mental map. Additionally, the ruins act as blinders to remove all distracting information, framing very clearly where to head next. Behind the player is a cave with some collectibles in it. They have to look to find it, but not very hard. Nonetheless, it should make them feel clever. The player has overcome several challenges at this point, so it's important that they feel rewarded. I'm not 100% sure what this architecture would be. In a professional game development setting, I would collaborate with an artist to figure that out together. Jonah can be seen across the gap, With animation, he would be waving the player over. Looping the player back over the trafficking camp this way reuses the space. The world feels more connected. It also gives the player a sense of progression and accomplishment, especially now that they're high above the area. Finally, for players who snuck past the enemies, the tension of climbing a rope dangling over the remaining baddies is harrowing. Upon reaching Jonah, the two characters express their happiness over reuniting. Then, he tells Lara that there's something she needs to see. Jonah walks into the jungle corridor, leading the player. An optional side path offers the player some agency, helping them feel in control of their experience, and making the world feel larger than it actually is. The characters catch up on what's happened since they were separated. Trees hug the player from both sides, acting as a calming presence. This downbeat lets the player recover from the back-to-back stealth combat and climbing. Jonah waits for the player by a small cave entrance, flanked on either side by more jaguar head statues, to make absolutely sure the player doesn't accidentally miss where to go. This section slows the player, which would allow the game engine to stream in the next area. Jonah says that what he needs to show Lara is on the other side. Meanwhile, the cave becomes more and more claustrophobic. Finally, the player stoops beneath brush and vines, slowly passing underneath them, building tension as the player wonders what's on the other side. To create a sense of awe, I borrowed the architectural concept of Arrivals. The tightness and drab cave colors preceding this space provides stark contrast to the expansive temple view, making the reveal far more satisfying than it otherwise would have been. On that note, the level ends. To bring the level to life, I scripted using Unreal blueprints for a number of things. The AI system included in integration with ALS only uses a vision cone for seeing players. The cone consistently detected the edges of the player hitbox, though, even while they were behind cover, which made the AI feel broken and unfair. To fix the problem, I programmed a second vision system in Unreal blueprints that used a raycast from the AI's chest to the player's chest. If the player was within the vision cone and the raycast succeeded, only then did it trigger the suspicion alert for the AI. The result is a fair and intuitive AI perception system that empowers stealth gameplay. For rapid iteration, I built a blueprint for collectibles that allowed me to quickly switch the type of collectible getting placed. It works in-game as well as in editor for easy visualization. I also scripted a placeholder rope arrow interaction for crossing the trafficking camp. Finally, I built a path system for placeholder AI with options for deleting after completing a path, switching paths, switching models, and waiting for a trigger. You saw this in action with Jonah's placeholder model and the guard walking into the storage shanty. I learned at least 2 megatons worth of design principles working on this project. The level increased my ability to handle documentation, player guidance, combat encounters, environmental storytelling, exploration, scripting, and even Unreal Engine itself. I'm wholly satisfied with my work, and also I know I could have taken the combat further by better matching it to the narrative beat. Additionally, the level is condensed, so some of the emotional beats feel rushed. In a real level design situation, I would stretch out the narrative beats a bit more so that the player wouldn't get emotional whiplash. To wrap up, I would like to thank my mentor, Max Pears, for providing guidance along the way and being kind whenever I stumbled. Well, that's it for me. Here's to making magic.